about the security challenges and destroying this sort of positive and nice picture that was drawn to us by the previous panel, I would like to invite the Polish ambassador to Sweden, Mr. Wisław Tarka, for a keynote address.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, the Embassy of Poland in Stockholm is a NATO contact point embassy for the second 2-year term. It means that we are trying to understand better NATO to Swedish audience and Sweden to NATO as well, so in both directions. This is especially important in the context of the current challenges in the Baltic Sea region. NATO is the most important and reliable pillar of security in the region and the best platform for multilateral security cooperation. Providing security requires not only a strong deterrence and defense posture, but also the ability to project stability and to strengthen security beyond NATO's border. In doing so, NATO maintains a broad and diverse network of partnerships with countries in the Euro-Atlantic region and beyond. Sweden remains one of our closest and most active partners. We appreciate Swedish partnership cooperation with the alliance, participation in NATO-EU projects, and proactive role in NATO's defense capacity building efforts. NATO partnership policy and projecting stability result from strategic necessity, which becomes even more essential today. At the Warsaw Summit in 2016, the Alliance took important decision to help its partners provide for their own security and resilience. Their implementation creates additional opportunity to further deepen cooperation between NATO and Sweden. As we stated in Warsaw, NATO will continue to strengthen its role in projecting stability, including through enhancing regional understanding and situational awareness, further adapting to the changing challenges and threats from all directions, reinforcing its maritime dimension and developing a more strategic, more coherent and more effective approach for partnerships. Ladies and gentlemen, the Baltic Sea is unique. Among littoral states, there are NATO and non-NATO countries, EU and no-EU members, and there is Russia with Kaliningrad Oblast. Although the Baltic Sea region is unique, its problems are not. Baltic Sea remains an important stage for Russia to implement its strategy of antagonistic policy towards the West, NATO, or other regions in the strategy, like Ukraine, Syria, North Africa, Western Balkans, Afghanistan, and the region of the Black Sea. The security situation in the Baltic Sea region has been at its worst for decades. Russia decided to launch its program of an extensive military build-up in the region. We know from the Russian side itself that the militarization of the Western strategic direction has been a pre-planned activity, which had been initiated already in 2008-2012 period. In fact, well before the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and NATO's reaction to it. The decision to militarize the Russian foreign policy and to deploy high-tech equipment to Kaliningrad was taken years ago. Kaliningrad has become the most militarized region in Europe. In fact, a kind of Baltic Sea fortress. It includes the deployment of highly sophisticated military systems, including rocket systems like Iskander, anti-aircraft system S-400, as well as modern electronic warfare systems. We observe constant strengthening of the military units present in the region, all steps designed to limit possibility of NATO response. Another worrisome signal is the hostile rhetoric of the Russian side and political statements aimed at particular states of the Baltic Sea region, suggesting their limited independence in the political and defense choices. We cannot accept that logic. Zapad 2017 will most likely be the biggest exercise in the region after 1991, with an offensive anti-NATO scenario, possibly with a nuclear component. This exercise poses a threat to the whole wider Baltic Sea region, possible element permanent Russian military built up in Belarus. The Russian activity in the region is a reason for growing concern. Poland proposed concrete actions aimed at reducing military risks, including, at the OSCE forum, a proposal to modernize the Vienna document in fragments concerning managing dangerous, hazardous military incidents, and backed by many countries, including Sweden. Ladies and gentlemen, in the face of Russian aggressive actions from the Baltic to the Baltic Sea, the countries of the region should deepen the security cooperation, not only within the framework of NATO and the European Union, but also bilaterally and in regional formats. We should strive to deepen in cooperation, making full use of existing bilateral and multilateral mechanisms like V4, N5, B3, strategic dialogues, Baltic Security Network, Northern Group, and of course in the framework of NATO-Sweden and NATO-Finland partnerships. Thank you very much for your attention.
Continue with the panel. I'm sorry I did not introduce myself. My name is Riina Kaljurand and I'm a research fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, in Estonia, and I'm also the director of the annual Lennart Conference, which is one of the biggest security and foreign policy forums in Northern Europe. I would like to give stage and invite to the stage my dear experts, panelists, and then I will introduce them to you. Well, the previous panel was very interesting, but during the coffee break, we discussed with each other that this was maybe a little bit too optimistic, because we have heard a little bit too many times that we have never been more secure than today. Unfortunately, challenges are always one step ahead of us, and these challenges that we are facing today have so many layers, and they have become so complex that I think that it is not only the sort of external threats that are challenging us, but also the internal threats. And it's the question of who we are and how we can deal with these issues that are sort of on our table on an everyday basis. I will first introduce you the panel, and then I will introduce you the structure of how I will conduct this discussion. I'm only gonna mention the current position of my panelists, because here's perfect biographies of everybody, and I will not waste time on those. But the first one is Dr. Jana Voglerin, who is head of the Alfred von Oppenheim Center for European Policy Studies at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Okay. I have here Karlis Neretnieks, who is a retired Major General, a grand old man of the Baltic Sea Security, and a current Fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences. I have here Dr. Mike Wennestig, who is Deputy Director of Research at the Swedish Defence Research Agency, and who is also now my colleague at the International Centre for Defence and Security in Tallinn as a non-resident fellow. And then I have Professor Matthew Rhodes, who is a Professor of National Security at the George Marshall European Centre for Security Studies in Berlin. I have here Mrs. Lolita Chiganen, who is the Chair of the European Affairs Committee of the Latvian Parliament. And last but not least, Ambassador Eitvydas Bajarunas, who is Ambassador at Large with responsibility for hybrid threats at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania. So I can represent Estonia here. But when we think of the challenges around us today, then I think that it's basically everything is having an impact. There are no regional or local challenges anymore, and everybody knows that. For example, when we take two examples, when Russia invaded eastern Ukraine, then people started to talk about the Baltic states and will Narva be next? This was a sort of very logical conclusion of the developments. When the US bombed the airfield of Syrian army 2 weeks ago, then also people started to ask, will the Baltic states be the next? Because we know that Russia is very much back, both politically and militarily, and not only in our region, but the game is played somewhere else on a very high level, and we are the ones who all get impacted by these challenges. Jana, it was actually your fellow countryman Helmut Kohl who said that European integration in reality will be a question of war and peace in the 21st century, and I think that he has been very right, because when you think of the economic crisis, when you think of the crisis with handling migration, I mean, all these tendencies feed aggressive populism. This leads to radicalization and marginalization of some societal groups, and we see Brexit as a result of it. We see Donald Trump as a result of sort of populist movements and this dissatisfaction within societies. And all that undermines the unity of our security institutions like European Union and NATO. And we do no longer know whether we can actually trust these institutions guaranteeing our security. And I would like to quote, just before I give a word to the panelists, I would like to quote our former president, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, who said that the road who has brought us here today does not lead us any further. So we need new ways to tackle new challenges. And I would like to start off with you, Matthew. I mean, we usually act after some sort of events or milestones. For example, like when Georgia happened 2008, then the Baltic states got contingency plans from NATO. When Ukraine happened, when Crimea happened, then, as a result of this, we have allied forces now on the ground, the Baltic states. But I would like to know, what do you think? After Brexit, when the UK is leaving the European Union, now there has been a lot of discussion how to combine the efforts of NATO and the European Union in order to somehow compensate the loss of the UK from the European structures. What do you think, all these efforts, this French-German initiative last autumn, which has now developed into policy and is now part of this global strategy of the European Union, is it real? Is there anything in it, or is it just a political gesture to show to our publics that we are doing something, that we show that here's the effort? And what do you think, what is the health of NATO today?
All right, I guess this is on? Yeah, okay. Well, first I should, guys, before I answer those easy questions, I should thank our moderator and the organizers for the chance to be here today. I should issue the standard disclaimer that my remarks represent only my personal views. And I'll try to put these in a little bit broader context. And perhaps just one small correction. The Marshall Center is not in Berlin, it's in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. And my Bavarian neighbors would be very upset to be placed in Prussia, but that's not so bad for me.
My mistake.
Anyway, but thanks. Okay, in terms of where are we in terms of the European security architecture to deal with this range of threats that we've been talking about already. I'll come off maybe being at least, I think that we're in a glass half full rather than half empty kind of scenario. For one, I think NATO has adapted better than many might have expected 3 or 4 years ago, and faster than many might have expected 3 or 4 years ago to the changed security environment. Perhaps not as fast as it should or will need to in the future, but overall I think it has done not badly. We've heard a bit about some of the other recent NATO summits in Wales shortly after the Russian annexation of Crimea back in 2014. We heard from the ambassador about the Warsaw Summit last summer. And as several of you here will be aware, there is another meeting that's not being called a summit. It's being called a special meeting. But it will take place among the heads of state and government of NATO in just about 1 month from now in Brussels. So this is another chance to come together to assess the security situation in Europe, to assess and discuss, especially with the new American President Donald Trump, how he views NATO and these different challenges. And certainly I know this has caused a lot of concerns across Europe. Some of his more critical statements about NATO and about alliances in general during his presidential campaign last year. On the other hand, in just the last couple of weeks, I think there have been some reassuring signals, at least for many in Europe. As you may have seen in the news, President Trump met with the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, in the White House earlier this month. And he came out with the kind of maybe soft compliment to NATO that it is no longer obsolete. This is, I guess, good news. It's no longer obsolete, but he still is watching what it's doing and so forth. And in terms of whether NATO will stay not obsolete, and in terms of whether some of the European initiatives that you talked about that have also been the subject of study in recent months, some of this, I think, will come back again, perhaps not to the country of my citizenship, but to the country of my residence and work for the last 14 years, and this is Germany. Ambassador Heimseth had already said quite a bit about the role of Germany. I think we'll be hearing more in just a few minutes. But if I can maybe just comment from an American perspective on the significance of Germany for the future health of the transatlantic relationship, the future health of NATO, and the future prospects for complementary security role from the European Union, I just would make a couple of observations. I'd maybe go back to what Ambassador Heimseth mentioned about the really dramatic shift in the perspective, at least of the German foreign policy elite, in the last 3 or 4 years towards accepting the necessity of a more direct, more active, more high-profile engagement in international affairs. Ambassador Heimseth mentioned this kind of pivotal speech that was given by the former German president at the Munich Security Conference in 2014. And I think to make another relation to the first panel, one of the arguments that the German president made was that if we're thinking about history, he said that for Germany, history could no longer be an excuse for an action in foreign affairs. So hopefully this is the right kind of lesson to draw, and I think Germany has followed up in many of the ways we've already heard. As an analyst, though, working in Germany, and in a German-American institution, the Marshall Center, there are a couple of potential challenges I see over the horizon. I think Germany, again, has made huge contributions to Baltic and European security in just the last couple of years. But to the extent of whether this can remain the kind of long-term commitment that the ambassador was talking about, there's three at least challenges, not things that doom Germany to not being able to play this role, but three challenges that could make it difficult. The first, and whenever an American talks about European security or Germany in particular, sooner or later they always come around to defense spending. Germany spends, I believe, roughly 37 billion euros per year on defense, which makes it the fourth biggest spender within NATO, and is probably of the members of NATO one that not only spends the most, but spends what it does spend the best, the most effectively. And I think this needs to be recognized. At the same time, if we're looking at the context of NATO, that budget accounts for just about 1.2% of the German domestic product. So well below the NATO target of 2% that was initially accepted by NATO defense ministers over a decade ago and was put down again at the level of heads of state and government at the Wales Summit in the Defense Investment Pledge, saying that 2% is what we will meet within the next 10 years. So I think it's important that Germany continues to increase its spending towards that level, in part because it shows solidarity and seriousness within NATO, a theme that has been important for American presidents since NATO was created in 1949, but which is especially important for the current American president, who has seen this as a very key indicator of alliance seriousness and solidarity also towards the United States. But perhaps even more important than this question of the political cohesion of the alliance is the fact that the various, I think, military commitments and security commitments that the alliance in general and Germany in particular have taken on will really demand a higher level of resources to be met. There was a famous study of the German armed forces that came out about 2 years ago that indicated shortfalls in a number of areas, especially in aircraft, naval readiness, and other things, to meet even the theoretical Article 5 commitments at that time. Those commitments are no less now, given the rising security challenges we face. So as Germany continues to modernize its military, as it continues to develop plans, as were discussed just this past week in the German press, for a reorganization and expansion of the German armed forces to the year 2031, it will need sufficient resources to meet that. Now with, again, defense spending being kind of the American fetish with any European allies' approach to security, this has to be met, but there are at least, again, in turn, a couple of challenges for meeting that. One is the question of whether there is political support for that within Germany. And if you look at recent public opinion polls, the answer is a resounding no. The few polls that I have seen over the last several months tend to say that somewhere between 60 and 70% of the German public is opposed to significantly increasing current levels of defense spending. Something in the neighborhood of 15% are actively in favor, and the rest are undecided or simply aren't paying attention. So there's, on the public side in Germany, not much support for this kind of additional spending that I believe would be necessary. And this is reflected then a bit on the political elites as well. Again, the current government, the Grand Coalition, has committed to, over the long term, moving towards 2% in line with the NATO pledges. But you see some differences and softness in support even there. If you look at the Christian Democratic Party of Chancellor Merkel, you have the strongest support probably within the government for meeting 2% at least as a long-term goal, but there's an emphasis that it can only be met very gradually, and there's also, I think, an undertone that it could not come at the expense of another political commitment, and this is to a balanced government budget, the so-called Black Zero, which is much beloved by the German Ministry of Finance, Wolfgang Schäuble. On the other hand, the Social Democrats are at least during the campaign, are saying that 2% is not even a goal, that they don't think it's a legitimate goal for Germany, or even something that NATO has committed itself to, which I would strongly disagree with. In practice, there might not be that much difference to how the two parties would approach spending in government, but certainly at the level of rhetoric there is. And then you have the remaining extremes on both the left and right in Germany, the Linke on the left and the Alliance for Germany, AfD, on the right. Both have seen, over the last couple of years, rises of support. The Alliance for Germany has done especially well in kind of regional elections, especially in the old East Germany, reaching up to about a quarter of the vote. Currently, they are doing less well, and are even this weekend having a very contentious party convention in Cologne over their leadership. But the rising support for both those groups who oppose defense spending also may make it more difficult. And the last concern is that even if you have remaining political support, this broad mainstream consensus for commitment to security, commitment to NATO, commitment to the EU, there's a question of whether the kind of underlying German economic miracle, which has done so much to be a basis for the current German position of power and influence in Europe, will persist. 2 years ago, Thomas Bagge, at that time the head of policy planning at the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, published an interesting article in the United States in the journal Washington Quarterly called Germany's Moment in a Fragile World. And he laid out in many ways the same rationale for why Germany needed to take a more active, engaged leadership role in security. But he also worried about whether, in the medium term even, Germany would be able to continue to support that economically. And he kind of forecast that even within the next 5 to 10 years, there were a range of economic challenges that could undercut the economic success that Germany has enjoyed recently. One certainly would be, since Germany is a major export economy, really the international champion in exports, there was a question of whether its export markets would continue to have demand for German goods. Either they would become weak themselves, not be buying as much, they would look elsewhere for suppliers, or they would engage in closures or restrictions of their markets. All those things we have seen signs of yet today. Another source of potential challenge would be shifts in industrial technology. Germany certainly has based its success on manufacturing, on its industry, but things like three-dimensional printing, self-driving cars, all could make the German export model much less attractive and successful. And last but not least is the question of demography. Germany, like many other countries in Europe, has a rapidly aging population, which means a relative shrinkage of the workforce, rising demands for old age pensions and health care. And so especially by the next decade, the wave of retirements and the question of whether key skills can be replaced could very much challenge Germany's economy. So I think it's Germany's ability to overcome these challenges will do a lot about how well NATO and the EU persist, how well the German-American bilateral relationship persists in addressing Europe's challenges.
Thank you, Matthew. I still hope you left something for Jana to say. Complete. Yes, some people or some countries may really be worried for militarized Germany, as is German public, obviously. But at least the Baltic countries, but also the Nordics, are very much expecting some sort of a leadership from Germany, and especially within the European Union context now, when the UK has left. and there is no similar mindset at the table anymore. So, what do you think when you think of, well, there is no really difference between internal and external politics anymore. Internal politics is very much external politics nowadays. What do you think, what is the most important question for Germany at the moment? Is it to keep Europe stable or to keep Germany stable?
Is this on? Yeah. Good afternoon. I think it is quite striking how relevant and important Germany got over the last years, and quite a fascinating example is that the American on the panel is talking more about the role of Germany when it comes to guaranteeing the security of the region than about the American role of the region. Whereas I have some questions personally about the American commitment in Europe, and I would be very interested to hear something about this maybe later on in the discussion. But yeah, I'll try to comment on everything, or not everything, on some of the points Matthew has just said, and maybe start with Germany's biggest worry. The question, I think, that concerns us here, security challenges in the Baltic Sea region, is how much have recent developments, let's call it like the Trump effect and Brexit, affected Germany's engagement in the Baltic Sea region in terms of security. And I think I have to start with a rather broad and European perspective, because the biggest worry Germany has these days is the state of the EU. Brexit is seen in Germany not as kind of singular event, although we hope that no other European state will follow this example, but Brexit is more seen as an indicator for things that do not go well in the EU, in the rest of the EU. We are very worried about growing Euroscepticism. We are worried about the threat of migration and the split that created this migration crisis within the European Union. We are worried about the nationalist movements, the populists, also the Eurozone, although not quite about the Eurozone lately, but we think the next, or in Germany a lot of people think that the next crisis is just around the corner. So to understand Germany, I think one has to understand that for Germany the EU is more than just one organization or one project, but it's Germany's core political identity. And it was already said that by Rina that it's a difficult role for Germany at the moment in the EU, because we are so important and we are the giant in Europe, and that puts a lot of pressure on us. A lot of countries expect things from us, others fear things from us, so I think Germany is in a very difficult position. And also when it comes to what role Germany can play in this region. The other big threat, security threat Germany is fearing at the moment is actually the state of transatlantic relations. And this is maybe different to what I have experienced lately in the Baltics and in Poland, because we Germans find it much more difficult to come back to this pragmatic, kind of optimistic approach towards the United States. We find it more difficult to go back to normal and to kind of develop this pragmatic optimism. Popular opinion in Germany is very much against Donald Trump. Anti-Americanism has always been present in the German society, maybe as in a lot of other European countries, but people really don't like Donald Trump in Germany. The problem is that everybody Donald Trump has said about Germany was not very pleasant before the Chancellor's visit, that the EU was a vehicle for Germany, that German economic policy was destroying Europe, that the Chancellor's migration policy was a catastrophic mistake, and then he had not very sympathetic words about this dear project, the EU, very dear to the German heart. He said that others will leave the EU, the euro is not sustainable, and for him it made no difference whether the EU existed or not. And people in Germany, like me, felt reminded on something Vladimir Putin has said about the EU, and we were actually afraid that both Russia and the US would actually hope that the EU would fall apart, and that they think that would benefit their countries. So with Brexit and Donald Trump, the two pillars of Germany's foreign and security policy are simultaneously under threat. And for Germany, a country that lives through institutions, that acts through institutions, and through these two institutions, the EU and NATO, this is a very difficult position. People in Germany started to worry that Brexit and also maybe Theresa May and the government, by seeking a good deal for Britain, could try to actively destroy and split up the EU, while at the same time Donald Trump, who openly said that he was more interested in bilateral deals with European countries, could also kind of do everything to split up the EU. So, and this is what we really fear the most, that this EU kind of splits up. And so the unity of the EU 27 is core. And I come this very long way to explain why, for example, this German-French initiative, the von der Leyen and the Rion initiative, is so important, because right after Brexit in Berlin, people thought that in the field of foreign and security and defense policy, the EU was underdeveloped, and there was also public support for this political area. And so this was identified as another project to create political unity and to have a joint political project, a European political project, and an integration project again. So for Germany, and that is different to the Baltics, it is not, it is of course NATO very important, and in our white book on defense we said yes, it's NATO first, but at the same time Germany nowadays puts a great emphasis on European defense and also on strengthening the EU in the field of security and defense policy. But it's very important to understand it's not either or, it's kind of European security and both institutions. But to strengthen the EU is very important, and also to make it a defense union is very important to Germans, and I think this is not a problem in the region, but sometimes it's understood differently, for example in the 3 Baltic states. Just a comment on defense spending, 2%, we talk about that all the time now in Germany. It's also election campaign. So NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance have been Germany's backbone, the backbone of Germany's security, and Germany has increasingly become the backbone of NATO. Germany is doing much more, it's leading the battalion in Lithuania, and will continue to do more, but the problem is that we question ourselves a lot whether if we really would spend 2% on defense, and we would be the largest army in Europe, if that would really please our Polish and our French neighbors. I know that the Baltics would like to see this development, and maybe also the Nordics, but with Poland and France I'm not so sure. And the question is not, I think, so much about spending. I mean, it's about spending and about developing capabilities, but it's more about political will. I mean, it wouldn't make any difference if Germany had a huge army and would never use it. So the problem is, if Germany is willing to develop the political will to use its capabilities and its army and to become a more active hard security provider. And I think this now, and I come to my conclusion right now, plays out in the election campaign already, because as I said, and as you said, public opinion in Germany is very much against Donald Trump and very much against enhancing defense spending. And so in the campaign, the SPD candidate Martin Schulz already said that Germany would not necessarily have to spend more on defense, and surely not spend 2% for the sake of Donald Trump. And the problem is that I fear that in this election campaign, the question of transatlantic security now is becoming kind of a tool in the election campaign, and because Martin Schulz always forgets to mention that that was already decided upon in 2014, and that it was not a present for Donald Trump to spend 2% now. So, but this is in the election campaign, it's difficult. And also, whereas Angela Merkel is much more transatlanticist, let's say, by nature, Martin Schulz is maybe more European by nature. So maybe, although there is 80% foreign policy consensus, I think there are differences in interpretation, and also, but I leave that to the discussion maybe when it comes to how to deal with Russia, how to contain Russia in nuances. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's quite appropriate to continue with Karlis, because I would like to ask you, Karlis, well, whatever we do in Europe or in transatlantic relationship, this impacts the behavior of Russia and the other way around. If we move a little bit closer to our region now, how would you assess Russia's behavior, and how is Russia taking advantage of the weaknesses of the situation where Europe is in at the moment, and how would you assess these sort of the military activities in the region?
Thank you, Rina. To be honest, I think I'll skip the Russian part, because Ambassador Turka, I think, gave a very good overview how Russia is behaving and what we can expect from Russia in this region, the Baltic Sea region. I will rather cover the second part of your instructions that you gave me. Sweden, Finland, the two odd men out in the region, not being members of NATO, and at the same time having the longest coastlines and, in the case of Sweden, the largest territory of all countries around the Baltic Sea. And what are we doing? And I will cover that very briefly, I think, with describing what the countries are doing about their own defences, the NATO question in both countries, and also Swedish-Finnish military cooperation. And when it comes to Sweden, we have slowly woken up and started to restructure our armed forces from an organization mainly geared towards international operations to an old-time organization geared towards territorial defense. We are introducing conscription on a very limited scale, but nevertheless. We are exercising a bit more, and we are increasing the military presence on the island of Gotland, that you all know. In the year 2018, there will be some 300 soldiers on the island. This said, don't expect any wonders. The Swedish defense budget today is around 1% of GDP, and there won't be any increases in the foreseeable future, perhaps 0.1% more or something like that. That's the situation today, anyway, among the political parties. Finland is in a much better situation, really, because they never abolished territorial defense. So they have a really robust platform to build on now that they are increasing their defense efforts. They are buying new weapon systems for their air force, they are buying new tanks, they are increasing their wartime organization from 230,000 soldiers to 280,000 soldiers. Quite incredible numbers when you compare with most other countries in Europe. Although there is something odd about this, they are not increasing their defense budget. But somehow they manage to do it anyway. Don't ask me how, really. But what they are really showing, that Finland is taking the situation here in our vicinity very seriously, and they are doing something really concrete about it. The NATO question. Both countries have, I would say, very strong ties with NATO. They are what you might call these gold card members of the alliance, or the PFP. They have host nation support agreements with NATO. They are participating in exercises on a quite a large scale, and their weapon systems are interoperable with NATO. But at the same time, both countries are developing bilateral ties with the US. Just to mention one example, there will be a very big exercise this autumn in Sweden, where the US will participate with ground troops, helicopters and ships in the Swedish exercise. Then, having said this, why don't they join the alliance? All objective factors point to such solution. Neither country is capable of defending itself without outside help. Why not prepare for that already in peacetime? Military operations could, of course, only be coordinated in a much better way among all countries in the Baltic Sea region, the Baltic countries, Finland, Sweden, Germany, Poland, and the US, of course. And that would, of course, increase deterrence. And that's the main thing, really, increasing deterrence, thereby making the risk for a crisis or a war much smaller. That would be in everybody's interest. When it comes to Sweden, I would say that the main reason why not joining the alliance is our domestic politics. At the moment, it would be impossible to create a majority in the parliament for joining the alliance. And some parties would also probably have very big problems with their internal cohesion if we try to join the alliance at the moment. The Finnish case is a bit more complicated, really. Politics also are of great importance, of course. But I would say that strategic deliberations and also history play quite a large part in the Finnish way of thinking. In the case of Sweden, we would be dragged into a conflict in the Baltic Sea area, regardless what we do, want, or what we wish. I think that's quite obvious. It's not equally clear for Finland, really. And I also think that historical experiences, in the Finnish case, plays quite a large part of their thinking. They have fought with the Russians 3 times, and then they had a quite nasty period after the Second World War, but somehow they have always managed to muddle through. And I would guess, or I would say that they want to keep that option open also in the future. So, and this leads, or has led to a situation where both countries have chosen an option of deeper cooperation as some kind of substitute for joining the alliance or joining NATO. At least they have chosen it in the public debate. There is no doubt that closer cooperation brings quite a lot of benefits. It might be money to save in joint procurement, although experience shows that it often looks better on paper than in reality, but nevertheless there might be some money to save. But the most interesting thing to my mind is joint exercises. This gives both countries opportunities to have larger and more complex exercises than they could organize on their own. And we already train on a routine basis. Our air forces train together every week, more or less. And apart from making the exercises better, of course, it also creates interoperability, something quite useful in case of war. But this does not solve the main problem. Are both countries prepared to go to war to help each other? Because that must be, let's call it, the goal if you really want a military cooperation, a deep military cooperation. Is Finland prepared to go to war with Russia to help Sweden to defend Gotland? Is Sweden prepared to go to war to help Finland to defend northern Finland in the case that Russia would like to increase its defensive zone about the Murmansk, around the Murmansk base complex? I don't have the answers. Everyone can speculate and think about that. When it comes to Finnish deliberations regarding very deep defense cooperation, we should also think about history. Is Finland prepared to make itself dependent on Sweden to be able to wage war? I don't know. There is, of course, much more to be said about this, but what I wanted to illustrate is that the Swedish and Finnish factors in the equation, I would say, complicate the security situation around the Baltic Sea quite a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. You raised some very important questions about Finland and Sweden, and I'm afraid that they will be unanswered for quite some time in the future. But at least I got sorted out one question that has been speculated about in Estonia, at least, that these bilateral security agreements with the US were not a shortcut instead of NATO, but this is just to increase the deterrence in the region. But I will continue with Mike. So the presence of NATO has increased considerably in the region. And in addition to these, cooperational structures between Finland and Sweden and also within NORDEFCO and some others, are we safe now?
Well, thank you, Rina, and thanks for inviting me. I have to start the same way as Matt did. I will only speak for myself during this conference and not on behalf of my employer nor the Swedish Ministry of Defense. There you have it. To start with your question, Rina, I have to say that we don't know yet. I will start with laying out three very important kind of fundamentals in the general area of East or Baltic Sea region defense issues, the geopolitical view, if you wish. The first one is that the Nordic-Baltic region is actually a strategic whole. You can't take one country away from it, or you can't, as a member or a citizen of a country, believe that you won't be affected by a conflict in this neighborhood. The second thing is that the United States and NATO then includes not only the Nordic-Baltic 8 countries, but also, of course, the bigger neighbors like Germany and Poland in particular. The United States and the NATO organization is virtually necessary, and not only virtually, it's absolutely necessary for the security of the region as such. But neither the EU nor Nordic cooperation in the defense field is enough for this. So we can't fool ourselves believing that the EU or Nordic cooperation or bilateral arrangements outside these frameworks would be enough for the defense. Because if you, as Carlos was mentioning as well, to today's weaponry, the long-range precision weapons and air defense missiles and so on, means that any time you have a conflict, a real military conflict in the Baltic Sea area, you will be affected by missiles flying or aircraft flying over your country, regardless of what kind of institutional affiliation you will have. In terms of why the United States and NATO as such are so important for peace and stability here, geopolitics in general and the balance of power imperatives in particular are crucial. You need to have external actors with you if you have a very big neighbor in your own vicinity. That is Russia. Militarily, Russia is very, very powerful. Economically, it is not powerful at all compared to other countries.